Well, welcome everyone to another edition of the Sync Up. We have a very special guest joining us today. He is a former NASA astronaut. He was awarded the Congressional Space Medal of Honor earlier this year, which is really tremendous and super excited. Also, a really good friend of Zinc. So, Doug Hurley, welcome to the Sync Up. It's great to have you.
I'm so excited to be here, and it's great to catch up with you guys.
Nice. And we should say it's our first guest that's recording from space. Doug's actually in space right now as we speak. So check it off the bucket list. But no, the background does look good. So,
Yeah,
but again,
I actually took that picture in space in 2020.
oh my
Okay.
goodness. Yeah.
So
Not many people can say that. So I was
it is
actually, yeah. If I
it
see
is
someone
my
else using
picture.
that background, I'm going to make sure they credit you because that does look pretty authentic. But that is awesome.
Nice. Sweet. Well, we can dive in. We're really excited. You know, the moment we had the idea for the podcast, Doug, you were always going to be like number one first episode to chat about. It took us a couple, but we're here now. So we can kind of jump in. So I think before we get into some of the more kind of Zinc related stuff, giving everyone a background on yourself, I think, you know, when people hear, hey, you know, I'm an astronaut, I don't even know where they begin to think about like how did you get into that space, and just giving some like insight into that
Yeah.
because I think it's a
I never heard anyone say that to me. So
yeah.
this is the first time.
When Will and I play golf,
Yeah.
we ask what they do. It's an accountant.
Yeah.
We don't get to hear astronauts.
Yeah.
So take
So
us into that. I guess that process and how you got to that point.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because I think, to end up as an astronaut, it's certainly not a first career for anybody. It's a second, third, fourth type of career. And for me, the avenue was, my background growing up. I mean, I had an incredible interest in airplanes and space, but that was really where it started and ended for the most part. But then, working my way to college, I had a couple folks just say, hey, you might want to think about taking engineering in college. And so I did and liked it, even though it was a lot of work. And then, you skip ahead a little bit as I was on a Navy ROTC scholarship through college and ended up with a commission in the Marines wanting to fly and was lucky enough to go through flight school, get pretty good grades and ended up flying F-18s in the Marines. And so that combination of tactical jet time and the engineering degree gave me at least the prerequisites to get into the Navy or Air Force test pilot school. I went to the Navy test pilot school. And then that ultimately is what made me competitive, I think, to NASA as an astronaut pilot. And so, once again, I don't think I started out as a kid thinking I wanted to be an astronaut, but it just was kind of one of those evolutionary things. And hey, it looks like maybe you could do this. And so I put my name in the hat in 1999 when I was a test pilot and then was selected by NASA, after going through the interview process and the medical process, selected in the summer of 2000.
how competitive is that to try to make it to NASA, or what's that application process even like? Could anyone apply for it? Is it like,
Yeah, they actually on purpose make the prerequisites pretty minimal, albeit, there are certainly prerequisites. These days, I think you have to have a master's degree to be even considered. Certainly has to come from a STEM field or thereabouts. We have picked educators throughout the years occasionally, but for the most part, your garden variety astronaut comes from a STEM field of some sort. And then traditionally over the years, and I mean, we've selected astronauts every it seems like every 4 years. It's about what it's been since they started back in the late 50s, early 60s. And then there have been some years where it was every 2 years, but for the most part, you're talking somewhere between 8 and 18,000 applicants that actually throw their name in the hat. And then, of course, there's a pretty long and drawn out process to kind of down select to the highly qualified folks as you go through.
is there some type of like it factor or something that just you can't put on paper that you see and you like they have it, like an athlete or someone else, or is it strictly the what's on paper, which kind of determines?
That's a really good question. I think really what it comes down to initially is certainly if you have, just for example, because I've obviously been through a selection process. I was lucky enough to get picked the first time. So I just didn't know any better, but there certainly have been people that have taken several times to get in. But in general, having been on that side of it and then been on the other side where I was on the astronaut selection board, you have this 10,000, just say, for example, you have 10,000 people that throw their name in the hat to start with. The human resources folks go through that list of people and make sure that they meet the minimum qualifications and all that stuff. Then those names are forwarded to Johnson Space Center. And then we have per kind of the way it's kind of split up, if you were, is different buckets of specialties. So for example, I was in the pilot group, obviously, when I got selected. There's a group called operations. There's a group called biological science. There's a group called physical sciences. So they kind of split them up, and then we get astronauts and other experts from NASA to sit individually on those groups and pick the highly qualified from that group. And that's all on paper. Then ultimately the process goes on for several months, and we get it from the 10,000 down to several hundred. They go through, the normal background checks and those kinds of things, reaching out to employers, so a little bit more insight. And then when all that information comes back, we interview roughly 120 people.
So there's only a certain number of like pilots you can take and operations. So like you can be like the third best pilot, not get chosen, but because you have to fill like an operational spot. So it's really like filling a team.
It really is. And it varies based on the years, because you kind of go into it with like, well, how many do we need based on the launch manifest, what we're doing, what we need for ground support for astronauts, what we need, the flight manifest, the crews, those kinds of things. And so it's kind of over the last, I would say, certainly since the end of the shuttle program, which is in the mid to late 2000s, we kind of pick a class. I think recently we picked them as small as 8 and as large as like 12 or 15. So you're kind of settling on about that 10% of, the group is what you end up picking. And that's a good number for the class. It's not too big, not too small. We certainly had bigger classes than that. When I came to NASA in 2000, that class of 96 was 40 some people. The class of 98 was, high 20s, low 30s. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but that's kind of a big group.
Very cool. My last question on that: are the classes competitive? Like, as you say, my class is better than. Is it?
Heck yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. You get very tight because your first 2 years there, you're doing pretty much everything as a class. You're training as a class. You're going to visit the other NASA centers as a class. You do a lot of bonding, and you get really close. And of course, yeah. And then it's, you're the new guys, so you get, an appropriate amount of probably, I don't know if we can use the word hazing anymore, but you certainly get picked on and, what do you guys know kind of thing, and what have you done for us lately kind of thing. It was certainly worse in a fighter squadron, but I think it's just, that's a good number. And then, you work your way through those first 2 years, and then you go off to do other things within the office and hopefully eventually fly.
I see Will is like already
done. I'm done.
I think he's Googling applications.
Yeah.
You got one book.
Yeah. That's why I said it doesn't matter if it's not on paper, because I might have I don't have the
before we started.
Academics.
Will's like, he's like, astronaut. I've never spoken to an astronaut.
Yeah.
Like,
the wheels are turning.
I think, Will, to answer your question though, I think that really it does come down. It's on paper till you get to that 120, and then it's a clean slate. Because that's the group that's going to get picked from. So that 120 is going to get whittled down to 12 in most cases. And it's how you come across in that room with 15 or 20 people peppering you with questions. It's certainly stuff that maybe you don't have so much control over, like, the medical stuff. I mean, you find out, I mean, we've had people find out, it hasn't, you know, it's not common, but we had somebody find out years ago they only have one kidney and they didn't know it. You know, there's bone density stuff we go through. There's all this medical stuff that we go through that, you know, in most cases, it's nothing serious, but it's disqualifying. For example, if you have kidney stones on Earth, that is the last thing you want to get in space. And so that's almost unequivocally a disqualifying medical condition, and you'd never get picked. Even though, and we've had that before, because like I said, I've been on several of the boards. You're like, I love this person. This person would be perfect. And then, you know, you get the medical whammy list, you know, after the class goes through their interview week, and you're like, oh man, you know, and it's just some weird medical thing that they can't get happy with, and that person is not going to be selected. And it kind of, frankly, it sucks, but it happens. It happens a lot.
It's fascinating stuff, and I guess in line with sort of how you qualify to become an NASA astronaut in the class, you've been kind of lucky enough to be part of, I guess, one of the most historic space flights. Talk about how that came to be. I think there's fascination by so much of us because that was, I guess, the first sort of commercial space flight and that sort of collaboration with SpaceX. So take us through that process, and like, how did it come that was, you know, this is Doug's show? Like, how did you and Bob get, how was it decided there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, you know, full disclosure, you know, the astronaut assignment process is always been, I mean, you know, there've been many books that astronauts have written. I remember Deke Slayton's book where he was, you know, wrote about how he selected, you know, the crews for the moon. So it is a little bit, sometimes it's partly just the chief of the astronaut office. And, but I think in this case, at least from what I know, you know, we had gotten to, you know, somewhere around 2014 probably is a good place to start. And I remember I was working, Bob and I both. Bob was the chief of the astronaut office at the time, and I was working as an assistant director in flight operations, which is basically the overarching division that owned the astronaut office as well as the flight directors. And so we were both in what you would term in the regular world upper management. And so, and frankly, I didn't know if I was going to fly again. And I'm sure Bob would be honest with you about that too. You know, Karen, my wife, had just flown in space the previous year. And, you know, we had a 3-year-old. So that was, you know, that was having your wife in space for 6 months and taking care of a 3-year-old. That was a pretty, you know, heavy year. It was, you know, so we were just trying to get back to a normal family life, figure that out. And I was trying to do my thing. And then our boss, the guy who ran flight operations, grabbed me and said, "Hey, what do you think about flying again?" And I was kind of taken aback. And I said, well, if it's something, you know, that is new or different or would take advantage of my skills, I said, absolutely, you know, but I'm not going to take the risk just to do a quote unquote another space flight. And, you know, and I think, you know, that's a little bit hard to maybe for people to hear that, but I get my only point being is I put my wife on a rocket twice. She had put me on a rocket twice. And, you know, the best you can do in those situations is your loved one comes back. It's very similar to like a military deployment. And so you really, and we had a young kid. And so there was, you know, there's all this stuff that goes in your mind, but it's like, hey, this is, you know, so anyway, we skip ahead a little bit. And he's like, yeah, I'm going to, you know, you and Bob and Sonny and Eric, you know, we're going to make you guys the first commercial crew astronauts. And then the ultimate plan there was at some point, because we had two companies, Boeing and SpaceX, you would work with both companies initially. And then at some point down the road, you would be, you know, the crew for one of the test flights. So the first, either the first Boeing flight or the first SpaceX flight. So it was a little bit of an evolved process. Now, getting down to SpaceX, I personally was probably one of about 5 people at NASA that thought SpaceX was going to be successful. And I know that's kind of hard to hear now, because of what they've done since. But it was a completely different animal back then. You know, they'd barely flown cargo flights to the International Space Station. They'd blown up a few rockets. They'd done this, they'd done that. And so, and of course, the other side of the road was Boeing, who, you know, aerospace defense stalwart, had been around for decades. And so everybody was like, well, Boeing should be successful. And, you know, if we get lucky with the second guys, SpaceX, then even better. And then now we see how that all turned out, because Boeing still hasn't flown a crewed test flight, and it's pushing 4 years by the time, at least on paper right now, they're tentatively planning to launch sometime in the spring next year, which would be 4 years after Bob and I flew. But anyway, yeah, Pat Forrester, the chief of the office, came to called me into his office, and he said, you know, you want to be the commander of the SpaceX flight? And I said, heck yeah. And I said, who's flying with me? And he said, Bob. And I'm like, can't be any better than that. My best friend. So
That's awesome.
It worked out great.
Early in your career, when you first started, was commercial flights even like a glimmer in your eye? That no,
I mean, you think about it. In 2000, we were in the throes of just thinking. I mean, we were just literally just starting to build the space station. You know, the first 2 modules of the space station went up about a month before we showed up at NASA, and hadn't been crewed yet. We didn't even put a crew on the space station until late in November of 2000. So a few months after we had started as astronaut candidates. So it was really commercial at that point. No one had talked about. There was none of the suborbital tourist these flights. I mean, it was and frankly, it was just NASA flying shuttle, building the space station. And then at some point we had got, you know, we had the Columbia accident, and at some point we had what was called Constellation, which was, hey, we're finally going to go back to the moon. And in the middle of all that, the administrator at the time, you know, was talking about taking advantage of the private sector to potentially save money and fly cargo flights to the International Space Station. And that's where SpaceX started to enter the game. But that was well into the 2000s. I mean, that was 2006, 2007, 2008. So we were still flying space shuttle. But then, of course, you know, in the middle of all that, you know, we had Columbia, and then that essentially spelled the end of the shuttle program many years later when I flew on STS-135.
Do you have any predictions of what, like, will it become commonplace, or think Zach and I will ever end up in space?
Gosh, I hope so, because I just think anybody who goes, it changes you, and for the better. And I want to believe it's like it was at the advent of aircraft, aviation. You know, when people first flew on commercial airliners or commercial airplanes, they were wealthy, and it was few, and it was only for those folks that could afford to do it. And then business, you know, the business people made it less expensive. And I think that's what it's always going to be about from an economical standpoint is, you know, we've got to make it affordable for everybody for that to happen. And I think it's progressing that way. I mean, I think it's still pretty expensive. I've seen, you know, for example, those folks that fly on a Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic, I mean, they paid a lot of money, you know, to go fly on those flights, and they're, for the most part, very wealthy or sponsored. And so we got a ways to go, but, you know, it took decades with commercial airliners too. And I think it's just, and then the other thing is just entrance into the marketplace and making it affordable and making it competitive, I think makes a difference too.
Yeah. I'm going to let Zach go first to space.
Yeah.
You tell me how it is.
Yeah. We were, if I had to put a number on it, we're at least 20 plus years before getting Will.
Yeah.
We got to work on that.
Yeah.
We got to make it like it. Yeah. It has to get to the point where it's an airplane.
Yeah.
As simple as an
airplane. If
airplane.
I can get a window seat, or then
he needs to be able to book on his phone.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
it needs to be seamless.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Nice. Well, we can maybe sort of dive into some of the corporate stuff at this point. I think
Yeah.
we've had the opportunity to sort of collaborate a lot on some of the virtual events. So I guess just sort of, Doug, like when you have an opportunity for kind of a speaking uh, event, whether it's virtual, in person, sort of talk about like, I guess, what the preparation's like. What are some of the messaging that you're hoping to kind of convey to the audience? Is that some of that stuff from what you've learned through all your years, kind of your, career in space and doing all this different stuff? Sort of what does that preparation look like for those events?
Yeah, I mean, and I'd like to tailor it to the specific, whether it's a group, company, whatever you want to call it. It's just tailor it to what they are doing. But then in the end, I think it's all about, you can talk about leadership, you can talk about followership, a lot of the things we deal with going to and from space. You're part of a small team and how you work together. And then I think part of it is just I think people want to hear a little bit about your experiences. And I think having been able to fly 3 different times into space, and they were three, obviously, like most trips you do, everyone is unique. And certainly, my three were unique. I did a big assembly mission on my first flight, 16 days, really long. And then after that, my second flight was the end of the space shuttle program. So it was the last space shuttle flight, very unique. And of course, like we talked about with SpaceX and VM2, that one was very unique. So people are curious about that. And I love to just interact with folks I mean, there is no question that's off limits. And you hear a lot, obviously. Everybody wants to know how to go to the bathroom in space.
Yeah.
And things like that. But I mean, and it really is, I just really try to tailor it to that group if at all possible, whether it's, whether they're working on a specific technology, whether I mean, you name it. And you can certainly, talk about lessons learned. You can talk about, things you would be able to do better in a group dynamic and how a group dynamic affects your success, or how you can overcome maybe some challenging personalities to get there, because that's really what it ended up being for, I think, a lot of us in the space business, because it's these small extreme environments. You're maybe put together with people that you really don't know at all or not very well, and you've got to turn it into a high functioning team in a very short amount of time. And guess what, all this stuff is expensive, really expensive. So to be able to manage that pressure, because it really it is to a large degree. And I think, frankly, I was lucky in one respect. It's because, where I came from, flying $50 million airplanes, you get used to the fact that, hey, if something happens to this thing, it's on you. And but you also have to consider the fact that, a space mission is just thousands of people, and frankly, a lifetime's worth of work, or career's worth of work, in some cases, and they're depending on you to do your part of the job correctly. And so, just to talk about that and how that affects, and how you can't do it yourself, how you have to support your teammates, and they have to support you.
Yeah, I think all those points you bring up, those like aligned with pretty much any corporate event or objective or goal you're looking to do. Like some component can be told through your story and your lens, and from such like unique perspective, because there's only so very few that will ever experienced kind of what you've experienced. So that's always amazing to see.
Yeah. No, it's incredible. I think the idea that, like, in a company, it equates very similar. Like, they're building with their technology to kind of deploy it to the marketplace and bring it out. You guys are building towards this sort of one very important moment. And it's almost like you can't fail type of thing, because of the investment that goes into it. There's a lot of pressure. There's so much there. So I think for like a lot of themes that we talk about for speeches and sort of what people are looking to get out of it, it seems like you have good experience. It's not just, I can touch on that. It's like, I live that.
Well, I think it's funny because this was one of these really key moments that I remember. Your space flights in a lot of ways are just blurs because it's just you're so busy and there's so much going on, and it's just this flood of different things you're experiencing. But I will never forget this moment in my first flight, and I was the robotics operator, lead robotics operator for my flight on my first flight. And so we are installing this critical piece of the Japanese laboratory, this huge exposed facility on the end of the Japanese lab of the International Space Station. No pressure. So I'm sitting there, so I'm already kind of pretty keyed up because it's like it was literally the we docked at space station the night before, and then this was the next morning. We're straight to work, and I'm sitting there. I'm at the robotics console. Of course, you have we have a R1, the person flying the robotic arm, and then you have the R2 who supports you, make sure you're reading the checklist and make sure you don't miss any steps. But the entire International Space Station crew is lined up behind me, looking over my shoulder. And I would have never, because there's a bunch of people on the ground watching, and there's people on NASA TV watching, and there's, whatever online. But what really was like, oh my God, no pressure. I got the commander of the International Space Station and all 5 crew members right there looking over my shoulder. And I was like, that was really like, oh, okay, no pressure.
And you nailed it.
Yeah, I ended up doing okay. And but that, and then, and that's where you have to, like many things, you have to trust your preparation, trust your training, trust all those, long days, short nights that got you to that point, got you ready for that moment. And, then in the end, you just got to execute. You got to trust yourself, trust your team, and back each other up. And that's what we did.
So how do you practice? Just simulators? Is that?
Yeah, it's all simulators for robotics. But the good thing for me, and I think, being a pilot, it typically translates pretty well with robotics because it's the same kind of thing. It's eye-hand coordination. It's seeing things in 3D, seeing things in space, predicting where things are going to go, and having maybe a bit of a touch like you would in an airplane. Yeah, my instructor, my robotics instructor for that flight, his name is Sarmad. I think he's working over in Europe now. He always called me the robotics operator savant because he seemed, I don't know, it just fit. But it's still, I can tell you, there were times in my, flying career before that where it's like, there should be pressure, but I never really felt it and I can remember that really resonated with me of, holy cow, there are a lot of people, want to make sure this doesn't go south. And so it was just kind of neat.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, I think robotic savant, I've read that I think your call name was Chunky?
Chunky.
Is that?
Yeah.
You better get that right if you're going to call out.
How did that one come out? How did that come to be?
I don't know if I can say this on a podcast. So what I will say is, yeah, it's from way, way back. So when I was a young fighter pilot, and my last name is Hurley, Hurl. And, so maybe there was a time when I did feel very good flying an airplane a long time ago.
Could be my nickname on most flights too. So
yeah. And I mean, it was not because of the flying. It may have been from the night before.
Got it. Yeah.
And it just like many, I mean, it's so funny because I saw a good friend of mine who was in my squadron. He was older, obviously, when I first got there. So I was brand new in my fighter squadron. He was our training officer. And I just saw him a week and a half ago. And it's just like, his call sign is Horse. And it's like, hey, Chunky, hey, Horse.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and so it just, I mean, and that was in 1992. So, I mean, do the math. That was a long time ago, boys. And so,
that's cool.
And it's just like yesterday. And it's just so fun to get back with folks that I flew with. And, we have a chat text, with a lot of the guys that were in my squadron back then. And, but yeah, it sticks from way back. Yeah.
That's so cool. So I think we have a little bit of time, and I don't think we can
Yeah.
leave without hearing a little bit maybe about some Elon Musk or SpaceX stories there.
Yeah.
Like what was there a lot of interaction? What's the
Yeah.
process like? What's it
No,
like working
yeah.
alongside someone like that?
Yeah. So it was interesting because as I said before, the four of us got selected. I want to say it was 2015, 2016. I can't remember, somewhere in there. And so, on one of the early visits out to Hawthorne, which is where their headquarters is for SpaceX, Hawthorne, California. So it's a suburb of LA. We got to meet him, and it was just kind of what you'd expect. He just said a few words, and then, frankly, we didn't see him again for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
And this the woman who was this, I think she still is the COO. Her name is Gwen Shotwell. She kind of ran the day to day, and she was incredible. And we saw her quite a bit, and she is just a force of nature.
Mm-hmm.
And but I do remember a couple key moments. The first one was, I think this was when Bob and I were in Florida before we tried to launch the first time. So we were in quarantine. Of course, you guys remember it was COVID, so it was even more strict being in quarantine, obviously. And so we were behind glass in crew quarters, and Elon came talk to us. And I'll never forget it. You could tell he was emotionally invested. And he said, I don't want to I got to paraphrase a little bit, but essentially what he says is, he goes, look, we have talked to every single person in the company, even the interns, to see if there's anything else that we missed, what else they can do. And we think, we've done all we can do, and, we think you guys are going to be good. And you could just tell it meant a lot to him. And for obvious reasons, he's got, instead of whatever, a satellite, some supplies, he's got two people, and, the world watching, and their families, obviously, that, are essentially in his company's hands now. And so it was kind of neat. And then I remember seeing, this is a long time after we got back, I remember seeing his post-flight or post-launch interview on NASA TV, and he almost, kind of started crying in the interview, as he was answering questions from the press. And it's like, I really did. And then, of course, when we landed, he was there. I couldn't believe it. He had, and come to find out, he had watched us splash down in Florida, or off the coast of Florida, obviously, and gotten in a jet and flown to Houston, and he beat us to Houston.
Yeah, I remember watching that.
Yeah. And so, so he was all in. He was invested, and the whole company was. I mean, it was, when we first started working with those guys, it was a younger group, and, we were stodgy old NASA. And, and I think part of the reason Bob and I were successful with SpaceX, because we had to build a relationship with them. They had to trust us just as much as we had to trust them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not going there and saying, well, I've flown in space a bunch of times, I know better than you what we need to do, and we just didn't do that, because there was no way that was going to work, A, and B, it wasn't our style. And frankly, we're close with a lot of those folks, whether they stayed at SpaceX or not. That is a bond that you're never going to break. To go through that experience with that group and be successful, and then literally the last couple months before we're supposed to fly, you have a pandemic, and we still ended up flying. So it's just, pretty special.
That's awesome. This was
Nice.
Yeah. So I can say I spoke to an astronaut. Yeah.
There you go.
I might apply if you see an application in there that's like with not so much experience, but it's good.
You sold well. And I think, when we're having conversations with our clients, there's just kind of, when we listen back to this, you'll see why, you're someone that, we have that full confidence. Like, when we bring an opportunity, we know you're going to deliver, and then some. So, back to what you said, that preparation, you trust it, and then you go and execute. So, it's, it was a privilege to be able to have you on, Doug, and we look forward to many more events in the future, whether in the metaverse like we've done, or
Oh, yeah.
in person,
Or on the moon,
or in space.
Yeah.
Wherever
Yeah.
that takes us.
Yes, but thank you so much. It was a great conversation, and that photo is not on an iPhone. You didn't take that in space on an iPhone, did you?
No, no.
I wouldn't think so.
Yeah, we have used the D5 cameras. They're pretty good cameras. And yeah, I was sitting in the cupola. And I think this is actually as you're going down around close to the kind of the southern part of our orbit. So it's the very southern part of the Pacific or the Atlantic. I can't remember exactly. I'd have to look. But as you're kind of going south and then you turn back north as you're going underneath the globe. So,
Wow.
And it just was like, wow, this is cool. And then, the cameras are such these days that they really come close to capturing what you see with your eyes a lot better than even maybe on my first flight. So
yeah. That's the mic drop moment right there.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again. And we can't wait till the next opportunity to work together.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks. It was great to catch up with you guys.
Awesome. Thanks.